Have you ever experienced that crushing feeling when someone criticizes you, where a few words seem to unravel everything you believe about yourself? Maybe you've noticed how rejection, even something seemingly minor, confirms every negative thought you've harbored about your own worth. Perhaps someone's silence feels unbearably loud, echoing through your mind like an indictment of who you are as a person. If you find yourself living in this constant state of emotional fragility, you've probably been told that you're too sensitive. Maybe you've internalized the message that you need to develop thicker skin or stop caring so much about what others think. But what if the root of this struggle isn't about sensitivity at all? What if the real issue is something far more fundamental, something structural in your psychological makeup? Carl Jung identified this condition as having permeable ego boundaries, a state where no clear distinction exists between your inner world and the external reality around you. Every piece of criticism penetrates straight to your core. Every rejection feels like it's striking at the essence of who you are. Every opinion from another person has the power to pull you away from your own sense of self. The truly painful part is that you begin to believe this suffering is somehow your fault, as if feeling deeply is evidence of some personal failing. Jung didn't interpret this as weakness, though. He saw it as arrested development, as a psychological structure that was never given the chance to fully form. The difficult truth is that countless people navigate through life without ever having constructed adequate psychological defenses. This isn't because of any inherent flaw or weakness. It's simply because no one showed them how to build these internal structures in the first place. Perhaps your childhood was one where affection came with strings attached. Maybe you learned early that you had to behave in specific ways to earn acceptance and love. Your emotions might have been dismissed, mocked, or treated as invalid. Every mistake you made could have been presented as proof of your inadequacy. Gradually, you absorbed the lesson that your value depended entirely on how others perceived you. This pattern affects far more people than you might imagine. Millions of individuals move through the world without a stable sense of identity, functioning essentially as mirrors that reflect the judgments of those around them. This creates a dangerous dynamic because without internal structure, you become enslaved to external reactions and opinions. Your sense of self rises and falls based on the feedback you receive moment to moment. Jung was clear that the ego isn't something we're born with in its complete form. It requires deliberate formation, strengthening, and differentiation. A healthy ego functions much like armor, not to make you emotionally unavailable or cold, but to allow you to exist in the world without shattering every time you encounter opposition or criticism. The goal is to develop a self so solid that no external criticism can erase your sense of identity, while remaining open enough to be genuinely vulnerable without being destroyed by that vulnerability. Understanding this begins with recognizing an important truth. You weren't born with a fragile ego. No infant enters the world believing they're worthless or that they must be perfect to deserve love. These beliefs are learned through experience, and critically, what has been learned can be unlearned through conscious effort and awareness. Jung observed through his clinical work that many adults suffering from chronic emotional pain aren't fundamentally weak. Instead, they're incomplete. They're unfinished at the precise developmental stage where their psychological structure should have solidified. The fragile ego isn't a permanent characteristic, but rather a consequence of an individuation process that was interrupted too early. Consider a child raised in an environment where love functions as a reward rather than a foundation. Every action requires approval before it's accepted. Making mistakes carries real danger. Displaying sadness gets labeled as dramatic or attention-seeking. Expressing anger results in punishment. Now imagine that same child attempting to form their own identity under these conditions. How can they discover who they truly are when every authentic aspect of themselves has been silenced or rejected? How can they learn to trust their own emotional responses when every genuine feeling they expressed was corrected, ridiculed, or punished? They learn far too early that their internal truth holds no value in the eyes of those who matter most. Because of this, they begin reshaping themselves to match external expectations. With each small compromise, each forced smile, each opinion swallowed to avoid rejection, their ego disintegrates a little more. By the time they reach adulthood, they exist in a state of profound emptiness. They may achieve success, earn admiration, or maintain relationships. But internally, all of it feels performative, like acting in a play. The performance is external, while their true self never had the space to genuinely exist. Without internal reference points, any criticism becomes an earthquake that shakes their entire foundation. Any rejection feels like a death sentence. Any silence from others gets interpreted as abandonment. Jung recognized that this type of ego cannot sustain psychological tension or handle ambiguity. It collapses because it was never constructed to endure. Instead, it was built solely to please, to survive, to adapt to an unpredictable world where authenticity represented danger. The overwhelming sensitivity you carry isn't a defect or character flaw. It's a psychological signal that a necessary structure was never solidified. What you need isn't strength in the conventional sense that most people understand. What you genuinely need is reconstruction of your psychological foundation. Throughout this reconstruction process, you'll discover that many defenses you currently employ aren't actually providing real protection. Isolation, perfectionism, arrogance, aggression, these aren't genuine strength. They're desperate protective mechanisms employed by an ego still trying to shield itself from original pain and trauma. Many people who are extremely sensitive to criticism and rejection develop specific defenses to cope. These defenses appear to be armor, but they're actually disguises, broken shields, rigid cocoons that prevent growth without stopping the internal bleeding. Jung was emphatic that the fragile ego often hides behind defensive masks that seem like strength, but are really crystallized fear. They're survival strategies rather than markers of psychological maturity. Defensive arrogance manifests as an inflated, almost theatrical posture where someone does everything possible to appear impenetrable. They become hyper-rational, cynical, or mocking. But a single careless comment is often enough to reveal what lies beneath, which is an absolute terror of appearing inferior. This arrogance isn't genuine confidence. It's fragile armor constructed to conceal the emptiness of an ego that feels constantly under threat. Social isolation represents another common false defense. Countless people today live locked inside emotional bubbles, not because they genuinely enjoy solitude, but because they're terrified of being hurt. They sever connections, avoid intimacy, and construct an invisible barrier where they believe they're safe. But fundamentally, they're only reinforcing the message that the world is too dangerous and they're too fragile to handle it. Perfectionism may be one of the cruelest false armors. The person lives attempting to execute everything flawlessly because they believe deep down that any failure confirms they're not good enough. This isn't the pursuit of excellence. It's self-sabotage disguised as effort. It's the fear of being witnessed making mistakes. It's the ego desperately hoping that if it never fails, maybe no one will discover the feeling of inadequacy underneath. Preemptive aggression involves the compulsion to attack before being attacked. People who react with hostility to any criticism, who become sarcastic, harsh, or cruel as a demonstration of strength. But Jung would identify this strength as neurotic compensation, a desperate attempt to protect an ego that can no longer bear exposure. All these false armors share something in common. They push people away, and by distancing others, you also separate yourself from your authentic self. The ego, contrary to popular belief, isn't the enemy. It's the bridge between your internal world and external reality. When that bridge is crumbling, your entire reality becomes unstable, chaotic, and unbearable. True psychological armor isn't constructed from fear. It emerges from differentiation between the ego and the self, between who you genuinely are and who you're attempting to appear to be to avoid pain. Building authentic defense requires laying the proper foundation first. Jung taught that this foundation begins with an internal movement, creating an observer within yourself. Someone who can witness without becoming confused, who can feel without being swept away by emotions. Most people believe they are their emotions. Being overwhelmed by sadness, anger, or shame means being sad, being angry, being unworthy. But this represents a dangerous illusion and perhaps the greatest trap for those attempting to strengthen themselves psychologically without understanding Jung's actual teachings. Jung proposed that the first step toward developing a healthy and resilient ego involves creating what he called the internal observer. This is a part of you that doesn't react, doesn't judge, doesn't collapse. It simply observes. This capacity for separation between what you feel and who you are begins forming the foundation of genuine psychological armor. In practice, this means that when you're criticized, instead of immediately plunging into the automatic thought that you're a failure, you begin to recognize that there's a part of you experiencing shame right now. Notice the crucial difference. In the first case, your entire identity gets swallowed by an emotion. In the second, there's distance, space, and clarity. This shift in internal language isn't superficial. It's revolutionary. When you begin naming your experiences instead of identifying with them, you start breaking free from the cycle of emotional collapse that defines a fragile ego. Jung understood the observing ego as the bridge between consciousness and the unconscious. When you activate this observer, you become capable of looking inward with honesty, but without judgment. You can perceive yourself as angry without acting impulsively. You can perceive yourself as insecure, but still maintain your position. You can perceive yourself as vulnerable, but continue moving forward with determination. That's the essence of true armor. You don't stop feeling emotions. You learn to contain them without repression. This ability doesn't arise spontaneously or automatically. It requires consistent practice. Jung believed the process of individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, begins with strengthening this internal observing capacity. It's what allows the ego to avoid being swept away by primitive forces emerging from the unconscious, enabling it to remain centered even when everything external is collapsing. People with permeable ego boundaries live at the mercy of every emotional fluctuation. But when the observing ego awakens, you begin constructing a firm foundation for your inner citadel. You stop reacting automatically and start responding with conscious awareness. This is when your armor begins taking real shape. However, even with this internal observer awakened, you'll remain vulnerable if you continue waging war against parts of yourself that you don't accept. You cannot build true armor while at war with aspects of your own psyche. This represents one of the most challenging yet liberating truths Jung taught. As long as you reject the darker dimensions of your psyche, you'll remain vulnerable because everything you hide within yourself continues controlling you from the shadows. The shadow in Jungian psychology encompasses everything you don't want to be, everything you've learned to deny, repress, and hide. Anger, envy, selfishness, fragility, ambition, lust, laziness, arrogance, and fear. Everything you've deemed unacceptable because someone taught you it wasn't appropriate or kind has been pushed into a psychological basement where you hoped it would die. But it didn't die. It remains there, watching you, slipping out through the cracks when you least expect it. In an outburst of anger you claim was nothing, in subtle self-sabotage that prevents you from completing important projects. In envy, you disguise as moral criticism. The shadow doesn't disappear. It infiltrates everything you attempt to control without integrating. Jung taught that what you hate most in others often reveals what you don't accept in yourself. This is projection. You see in others what you refuse to see in yourself. As long as you continue believing the problem exists in other people, you'll never free yourself from the pain being generated internally. Integrating the shadow is essential to developing real psychological armor, because a criticism only destroys you when it touches a shadow point you haven't yet recognized. An insult only brings you down when there's a part of you that still believes it's true. And that part has been exiled, hidden, denied. Try this exercise. Make a list of words that hurt you most when directed at you. Selfish, weak, arrogant, stupid, lazy. Then with brutal honesty, identify situations where you've acted in those ways. Not to punish yourself, but to accept that you're human, that these aspects exist, and that their existence doesn't make you less valuable. It's the hiding of them that creates suffering. When you integrate the shadow, you become whole. When someone accuses you of something you've already recognized in yourself, it doesn't destroy you. It merely informs you. Pain transforms into reflection. Reactivity shifts into clarity. At this point, your armor becomes genuine because you no longer need to pretend perfection to feel worthy. You're complete, with both light and shadow. Beyond shadow work exists another deeper layer requiring construction to consolidate your strength. An unshakable internal foundation that neither the opinions of others nor your own doubt can destabilize. A solid core of identity. Every genuine armor needs a core, and that core isn't constructed from appearances or external approval. It's built from deep convictions about who you are, truths that remain even when everything external crumbles. Jung understood this as the necessity for an ego that possesses a center, a self capable of sustaining its integrity without depending on reflections the world provides. The problem is that many people construct their identity based entirely on others' opinions. When those opinions fluctuate, as they inevitably do, identity collapses along with them. The result is that familiar pattern. You feel good when receiving compliments and devastated at the slightest criticism. This isn't emotional stability. This is psychological dependency. The inner citadel represents the opposite. It's the space where you gather and protect the most fundamental truths about yourself. These aren't motivational phrases or egoic idealizations. These are realities observed with radical honesty. I honor my commitments. I remain calm under pressure. I make mistakes but always return to center. This is the raw material of true armor, internal evidence. The exercise is straightforward but profound. List 5 to 7 non-negotiable truths about yourself. Things you've lived, that you've upheld in difficult moments, that you've proven to yourself. When the world tells you that you're nothing, you'll look at this list and remember who you genuinely are, and no one can take that away. Jung emphasized that without this foundation, the ego cannot withstand the process of individuation. It collapses under pressure or becomes rigid and false. The citadel is what allows the ego to remain flexible yet firm, open to feedback but not dominated by it, willing to grow without compromising core values to please others. Even with this foundation built, threats can still arise not from external sources, but from within your own mind. Internal voices repeat old criticisms, knowing exactly where to press to dismantle you. Jung knew these voices aren't you, but they possess power over you until you examine them with courage. There's a voice inside that knows precisely where to strike. It knows your fears, insecurities, and weaknesses. It calls you incapable exactly when you try moving forward. It calls you ridiculous when you dare express yourself. It calls you weak when you feel pain. This voice is so intimate and familiar that you believe it represents your true self. But it doesn't. Jung discovered that much human suffering arises from unconscious fusion with the inner critic, a psychological entity formed by echoes of the past. Harsh parents, humiliating teachers, emotional abuse, constant comparisons, unintegrated rejections. This voice doesn't speak truth. It speaks fear, memory, trauma, and conditioning. As long as you simply listen without questioning, it governs your life automatically. For Jung, the most powerful method to disarm this force was active imagination, a conscious dialogue with internal voices. Not to silence them, as many attempt, but to understand them. But everything you face with presence loses its power to destroy you. This process begins with a simple yet profoundly unsettling question. Who is speaking inside me right now? When the avalanche of self-criticism arises, you're not good enough, you'll never succeed, you'll embarrass yourself. Instead of accepting these statements as reality, make the Jungian move. Personify this voice, observe it, give it form. Ask where it came from. What is it trying to protect you from? Why does it appear every time you attempt something new? This type of questioning dismantles the illusion that the inner critic is your conscience. It isn't. It's an old part frozen in time that still tries protecting you with strategies that may have worked when you were 5 years old, but now only sabotage you. When you create this conscious dialogue, something extraordinary happens. The voice loses its tone of absolute authority. It hesitates. It responds. And you realize, sometimes for the first time in your life, that it's not an enemy, but a part of you that never matured. A part that still believes you're in danger when all you're trying to do is live authentically. This is where your psychological armor truly solidifies. When you learn to listen to the inner critic without obeying it, you stop being dragged by it. You become the center, the adult, the self. The strengthened consciousness that Jung emphasized as the pillar of the individuation process. There remains one essential element, a skill Jung considered the pinnacle of psychological resilience: the ability to hold two opposites simultaneously without collapsing. To recognize that a criticism may contain something useful without allowing it to define your worth. To understand you can be both strong and vulnerable, confident and uncertain, complete and still growing. This capacity for holding paradox completes your armor. It allows you to receive feedback without being destroyed by it, to acknowledge your flaws without losing sight of your strengths, to remain open to growth while standing firm in your core identity. This is the ultimate achievement of the individuation process, the ability to contain contradictions within yourself without fragmenting. Consider which phrase from your inner critic impacts you most strongly today. Writing about this and reflecting on it already begins the individuation process. True psychological strength emerges not from becoming impervious, but from developing the capacity to remain intact while staying genuinely open to life, to others, and to the ongoing process of becoming who you truly are.